Hey y'all, it's Heel Heat time.
Hi everybody and welcome to Heel Heat. My name is George Coles and this is an episode of It Came From the Network. On this episode, by request from our good friend Christian, and no, not the wrestler, but probably just as cool if not cooler, NWO Sold Out from 1997. Let's jump right into it, into the first match. This is one I actually had high hopes for. I didn't much remember it from the show, and I didn't remember much of the show, to be honest with you. But the first match was Chris Jericho versus Masahiro Chono. Two excellent wrestlers, two of the top probably 5 or 10 wrestlers of the last 20 years. And it was kind of a boring, simple match. I don't know if maybe just their styles didn't mesh well with each other or what the situation was. I know Jericho, even before this time, had wrestled extensively in Japan, so I don't think it's so much of the Japanese versus American or Canadian style. I think maybe just the two of them just didn't mesh well together. Chono picks up the win, puts up the NWO in their first match, or the first match of the card. Picks up the win for the NWO. Next up, we have Hugh Morris versus Big Bubba Rogers, who most normally remember as the Big Boss Man in a Last Man Standing match. Again, another pretty sloppy, a little bit of a lumbering match. Kind of boring, kind of with what was going on in the in ECW at the time, to throw on something like this and have elements of hardcore in it that were not necessarily up to the ECW standard or even up to, what we had seen in other hardcore matches in WCW. It was kind of weird. The ending was kind of cheesy, where you got Big Bubba Rogers grabs a motorcycle from one of the women that had been sitting out on ringside, and we'll talk about that more in a little bit. Grabs a motorcycle and runs over Hugh Morris, although you clearly see Hugh take a bump over the motorcycle. But, I don't know, it was just weird. It was lumbering. Big Bubba Rogers picks up the win. We see the NWO starting to roll on the NWO pay-per-view. Next up, we have Jeff Jarrett versus Michael Wallstreet, who is also known as Mike Rotundo, or IRS more famously. This was a decent match, not really bad, not really good. At the end, Mongo McMichael, who was one of a number of WCW wrestlers that we've seen in the crowd, Mongo, the Nasty Boys, Harlem Heat, Arn Anderson, were all shown to be in the crowd at some point or another, presumably to set up a fight at some point, or in case one of their WCW guys got jumped, they would help, which it never really came to fruition. So other than Mongo coming out with Deborah McMichael, who at the time, if you remember, there was a tease between Deborah leaving Mongo for Jarrett, which I believe she eventually did. But this was the beginning of it. Deborah talks Mongo into hitting Jarrett with his steel briefcase that we always see Mongo carry. So, I don't know, just a weird payout. Jarrett picks up the win. Just a weird match. Not a horrible match by any stretch of the means, but just weird. Next up, we have Scotty Riggs versus Buff Bagwell in a match of the American males. Timeline-wise, I don't remember how closely this was to Buff turning on Riggs and joining the NWO, but I don't think it was much more than maybe 2-3 months at the most. there should have been more hatred and more anger in this, and it wasn't. It was more of a scientific type match. It was good, don't get me wrong. Both guys are good wrestlers. Both guys are very entertaining. Buff was starting to get into his more NWO, more egocentric character. You could see him flushing it out. Riggs was kind of like a man without a country. At this point, this was before he joined the flock. He was just part of the WCW anti-NWO squad, I guess you could say. Buff picks up the win, as it probably should have been, because as you follow through the years, they wanted to make a bigger star out of Buff Bagwell than they did out of Scotty Riggs. So it made sense at the time. Just felt like there should have been more of anger in the match, more violence, more betrayal. You know, if most matches where you see a tag team partner that's turned against his partner, you get a lot of anger. You get a violent, bloody match, but this one wasn't. Next up, we have Diamond Dallas Page versus Scott Flash Norton. This was DDP transferring from his heel persona, from the persona we seen him wrestle against Mark Merrow and others with the cigar and everything, to more of the DDP that became one of the top guys in WCW. We see them go, a lot is being made of DDP turning down the NWO. During the match, the NWO comes out, gives him a shirt, he seems to join, and then all of a sudden he starts hitting diamond cutters on everybody. Just what it was at the time. I believe they'd already done something like this, and this was the second iteration of the same gimmick, same angle. As I was watching, I didn't notice that DDP won before they did the whole NWO coming out angle, or if the ref refused to count, because it was kind of simultaneously with when they would announce the winner that the NWO came out. So it was kind of a weird, schmozzy kind of finish. I don't know. But all in all, a decent match. DDP went on to bigger, better things, and this was one of the starts at the beginning of his real push coming for him. Next up, we had one of the better matches of the night. I would say probably the second best match of the night. The Steiner brothers, Rick and Scott, versus the Outsiders, Kevin Nash and Scott Hall, in a very good tag team match. Two of the better tag teams in wrestling at the time. The Steiners, one of the great tag teams of all time. The Outsiders, two of the great talents of all time, and actually a very good tag team. I think a little bit underrated in my opinion, but still a very good team. The match was very good, very solid, very hard-hitting. A little bit weird on the commentary that they were talking bad, and actually they were talking a little bad about Scott Steiner, but they also gave him some praise during the match, so maybe it was a foretelling of his turn that came later. The end comes where Nick Patrick takes a ref bump, and while he's to the outside of the ring, the Steiners get the upper hand. We see Randy Anderson, who was one of the WCW people in the crowd, one of the WCW referees, jumps the guardrails, taps Rick Steiner, tells him to go in the ring, that he'll count the pin. We see Rick Steiner lay out Nick Patrick and then go in the ring, which is something that the commentary team, which was Eric Bischoff and Ted DiBiase, totally ignored, that Rick Steiner knocked the referee down, the actual official for the match. They go in, Rick Steiner picks up the pin, and the Steiner brothers reportedly win the WCW Tag Team Championships. The next night on Nitro, I know it's not part of this, but the next night on Nitro, Eric Bischoff reverses the decision because the Steiners hit the referee, which you could plainly see. But it was a good match either way. The fact that the results didn't stand is pretty much par for the course with what NWO was doing at the time and what WCW was doing at the time, so I didn't really mind that so much. And you got to look at things like this in the context. This is probably when WCW is at its hottest point. They were testing out, seeing if they could run 2 pay-per-views per month. 2. They want to run 24 pay-per-views a year. Think about that. Think of how much we get burned out by 12 pay-per-views a year. And imagine doubling that. It's kind of ridiculous to think that they were trying this, but they were hot. They had a license to print money, and they were just printing it. And that's the era we're coming from, where they were hitting on almost all cylinders. Next up, we have Eddie Guerrero versus Six, a.k.a. the 1-2-3 Kid, a.k.a. X-Pac, Sean Waltman, in a ladder match for the U.S. Championship. This was the match of the night, and probably one of the greatest matches in WCW history. Just a fun, exciting match with two really good wrestlers that really made use of the ladder, really brought it into what they did, the psychology, the whole spectacle of it. They get to the top of the ladder at the end of the match. They're fighting over the belt, over the U.S. title, and Eddie Guerrero falls with it, thus making him the champion. Just a great match and a great outcome with two great wrestlers. Kind of sad that it went on this show, and this shows what it is. But it was a great match nonetheless. Should have been a Starrcade match or a Great American Bash match. You know, something that goes along with the pageantry and the grandiose nature of those events. However, I guess it's the match that you point out and you say, this is why you watch this pay-per-view. For this right here. Next up, I touched on it a little bit ago. All throughout the night, they were showing different women on their motorcycles and saying they were going to name Miss NWO for the night. So we get into a very long and drawn-out segment with a bunch of women who, some were very attractive, some were very average-looking women. Basically, it looked like they went to a local motorcycle club and said, hey, have all your women come down, and we're going to have them on the show. Which, don't get me wrong, I have no problem with that. I have no problem with the women they put on there. Like I said, some of them to me were very attractive, and some not so much. The problem I have with it is how long it drug on. This was about 15 minutes of the show that we could have had filled with something better, like a match, a promo, an angle. The lady that won, I don't recall ever seeing her on WCW television other than this. So it really, I don't know, it was really weird. And then at the end, we see the winner, who seemed to be, and if I could explain this without, again, I'm not trying to offend her or anybody or judge her, but the best way I could describe it is she looked like a middle-aged soccer mom, if that makes sense, in biker gear. At the end, we see her and Bischoff making out pretty profusely, which was really weird. Again, I'm not dissing it, it just, the whole angle was strange and weird. If it would have been something where the winner went on to be part of the NWO whole thing, where they had a Miss NWO walking around with them, it would have made more sense to waste this much time. But for a one-off thing that probably should have been done in a dark match environment, it just didn't feel right. And it wasn't used while they set up like a cage or something that would have made sense. It was just something as a buffer filler in the show. Now, last but not least, we have the World Heavyweight Championship, the Giant versus Hollywood Hulk Hogan. We see, prior to this, the backstory is the Giant was part of the NWO, won World War III, which gave him a championship match anytime he won it against Hogan or whoever the champion may be. We see the tension between them two. Giant gets kicked out of the NWO, but asks for this match. And then we see it turn out just like most NWO championship matches happen. It ends up being a schmoz. The NWO run down, but before they get away, they all pretty much get chokeslammed by Big Show, until I believe it's Hulk Hogan gets a guitar and hits the Big Show in the back, which we see powder flying out of the guitar. If anybody out there can explain this to me, is the baby powder in the guitar just for the show, or is there an actual reason why they do that? Just let me know. I have no clue. Just put it down there in the comments if you know why. Because I don't. It doesn't, to me, it doesn't really add that much because everybody knows that there's not baby powder in guitars, so you know that it was added. Anyway, back to the match. Giant gets hit with the guitar. They all beat him down. Spray paint NWO for life on him, and then the show goes off the air. So all in all, we had one very good match, one excellent match, and a bunch of filler. A bunch of crap. It almost felt like, how could I put it? It wasn't even a good episode of Monday Nitro. This was like maybe the best episode of Thursday Night Thunder. I want to take Eddie Guerrero versus Six and take it off of this card and get it from around what everything else is on here. And the Steiners and the Outsiders too. That was a very good match as well. But everything else, I mean, if you just read down the list, Jericho versus Chono. Jericho wasn't yet a star, and Chono was a foreigner who, yes, huge star in Japan, and for a lot of us that follow that, a very huge star. However, to the mass wrestling viewing audience in 1997, neither one of these guys was a star. Hugh Morris versus Big Bubba Rogers. Hugh Morris was never a star. Big Bubba Rogers, his time had come and went as the Big Boss Man. This incarnation, probably I would say one of the low points of his career. Jeff Jarrett versus Michael Wallstreet. Jeff Jarrett was a big star at one point in pro wrestling. Michael Wallstreet as well. Michael Wallstreet, though, that gimmick was total crap. So this made it look like a star versus a jobber match. Scotty Riggs and Buff Bagwell. Again, two mid-card talents. At this time, Buff hadn't even raised up to be a mid-card talent. Wrestling a match. DDP versus Scott Norton. DDP wasn't yet what he would go to be. He was in the build to it. Another match that could have easily went on Nitro. Steiners versus the Outsiders. No argument there. Two superstar teams. Guerrero versus Six. Two rising stars at the time. And in all fairness to everybody else I just mentioned, not real big superstars as of yet. Six, yes, maybe. Guerrero, not. Then we got the real star, Hogan, and the Giant, who was being billed as a major star. So if you look at it, the star power on the show is missing. They could have had so much more. I mean, you had Harlem Heat, which was big stars in the company. The Four Horsemen were there, big stars in the company. Rey Mysterio, not on the show. You know, Lex Luger's not on the show. Sting, we only see in the crowd. So, to me, it felt like a B show, like a Monday night, a bad Monday Nitro, or a good Thursday Night Thunder. But basically, we're going to go into the ratings from that. Now, if you've seen it came from the network before, or even if you haven't, we have a 1 to 5 scale. 1 being the worst, 5 being the best. 1's a gobbledygooker, 2's a renegade, 3 is a Hurricane Helms, 4 is a Gold Dust, and 5 is a King. I'm going to give this show a 3, a Hurricane Helms, based on the strength of Guerrero versus Six and the Steiners versus the Outsiders. Other than that, I would skip everything on the show. So if you're going to watch it on the WWE Network, just skip to those 2 matches, which are back-to-back, and watch them only, is what I would recommend. And, again, this is for you, Christian. Thank you for the suggestion. And if anybody else has any suggestions what they might like to see me review, now remember, the confines of the show, it came from the network, is I have to be able to find it on the network. The reason I do these is to point out weird and wacky and campy and sometimes even just bad shows. Kind of an homage to Mystery Science Theater in our own way. Reviewing stuff like they would review in movies, but we review it in the wrestling world. But again, thank you, Christian, for the suggestion. If anybody else wants to suggest anything, feel free to. I will tell you straight up if I'm going to do it or not. Sometimes I've had suggestions that just didn't work for me, that I couldn't do. But anyway, I digress. That's all I have to say about this. My name is George Coles, and this has been an episode of It Came From the Network.